I have to say, I love coming to this event. It's been great to watching it over the past few years as it has grown, and we've seen more and more people get involved in MDIC, more and more people getting excited about MDIC, and MDIC taking on increasingly greater challenges, and we're going to talk about some of those today. But what I'm going to focus on are the strategic priorities for CDRH. Where are we? Where are we heading? And try to put things in context for a number of the other discussions you're going to get the privilege and the joy of hearing from later today. So with that, let me kick it off in saying that everything we do starts with our vision, that patients in the U.S. have access to high-quality, safe and effective medical devices of public health importance first in the world. And as you've heard me say before, this is not about a competition between countries. It's simply a recognition that we want technology to benefit patients, but it's of no value to patients if they don't have access to it. And first in the world is simply a good metric of timely access. Now here's a challenge we face in the U.S. We have a fabulous standard to market for protecting patients, and that's reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness. But because it's one of the highest bars in the world, and most other countries have a standard of safety and performance, there's generally a lot more evidence you need to collect to meet that standard, particularly for high-risk or innovative low-risk devices, and that can create disincentives to bring new technologies to the U.S. market early, if at all. Now, the solution for us and what we've been working on is how can we sufficiently reduce the time and cost of the total product lifecycle, device development, assessment, all the way through reimbursement, such that innovators find the U.S. marketplace attractive, but not compromise that standard of reasonable assurance of safety and effectiveness, and if anything along the way, generate more robust data. Because data, sound science, is the lifeblood of the decisions we make and the lifeblood of making smart decisions by patients and practitioners. Now, our strategic priorities have been focused on addressing this specific particular issue. And what you can see on the left are strategic priorities in 2014 and 15. We have not finished on those priorities. They continue. And what we're doing in 2016 and 2017 is we're building on them. So let me walk you through. So first off, in 2014, we had a big focus on strengthening the clinical trial enterprise, because if you have to get clinical data, far and away, that is the most time-consuming, expensive part of regulatory requirements to meet to get your product to market. But there are a lot of issues with clinical trials, and our focus was not just on the FDA piece, but the things that go beyond it, things that Dr. Califf was talking about this morning. But regardless of what you do with a traditional clinical trial, there are limitations you simply can't get past. One, you can't conduct a clinical trial that's going to answer all questions and give you full knowledge on a medical device. To do so, those trials are so large, they're prohibitive. But at the same token, even if you did it, clinical trials are not going to give you necessarily the true benefit-risk profile of that technology, which you only understand when it's being used in routine clinical practice. The only way to understand it is you have to assess devices in the wild. So our focus has also been on how do we better understand real-world use and the true benefit-risk profile of technology. And today, there's data being collected as a part of routine care, but we can't make good use of it. One, we may not know what device was used because it's not well demarcated in electronic health information. And that's why one of our approaches is we have to get unique device identifiers into electronic health information, into electronic health records, registry, payer claims, and other data sources. But also that information may be incomplete. Different systems may use the same term, but they have different definitions, so we're collecting different information. There's issues with data quality, and the systems, as you heard about, may not talk to one another. So our strategic priority on establish a national evaluation system for medical devices is about how do you solve those challenges so we can essentially turn lemons into lemonade of the data we have out of routine clinical practice. And the system we would set up is called the National Evaluation System for Health with a small h, Technology, or NEST, why health technology rather than just medical devices? Because the information we're looking for does not just pertain to medical devices. There are, as you heard from Dr. Califf, and as we well know, there are always technologies today that gather information on people, gather information on the impact of medical devices, and we want to leverage that. So we talk about health technology. In addition, on clinical trials, one of the other issues is in designing it, there are a lot of challenges in recruiting subjects, and that's because we typically design a clinical trial around the needs of the investigator or the company, not around the lifestyle and the needs of patients. And so we have lots of challenges in recruitment, and part of our strategic priority on Partner with Patients is trying to address that. Also, one of the big drivers for innovators isn't just clinical data, it's all the data I need to get to market. And if we can sort of figure out the rational circumstances under which pre-market data, or at least some pre-market data, might be shifted to be gathered in the post-market setting, that has an impact on the calculus for when technologies come to market, but again, not compromise that standard to market. And that strike the right balance in pre-market and post-market data collection. One of the things we did is to establish a pathway for breakthrough devices, the Expedited Access Pathway Program, which we started piloting in 2011 as the Innovation Pathway. And part of that program allows, in appropriate circumstances, and we're talking about real breakthrough technology, treating, diagnosing a life-threatening condition where there's an unmet need. And in those circumstances, where appropriate, allowing some pre-market data to be collected in the post-market setting. But here's the challenge. If you conduct a study post-market, patients don't have incentives to enroll in those studies. You heard that from Dr. Califf, and that's even greater in the post-market setting. So part of the issue with NEST is establishing that infrastructure that if the data is already being collected and there's the infrastructure to gather it, then you have the confidence you'll get the answers to the questions that today we often don't get to answer. And that has a big impact on that calculus for data shifts. And then finally, we were focused on providing excellent customer service, because if we can anticipate and proactively address the needs of our patients and our customers, then we can make better decisions, and our customers have a better experience too, and that impacts decisions on where you bring product. And part of that then goes into our Partner with Patients, because our #1 customer are patients. Improving the health and the quality of life of patients is our job #1. And to get there, we have to move away from the idea of patients are passive recipients of our information, or they're people we want to get information from. They are our partners. We need to treat them that way. And that's what that initiative is about. And then finally, I mentioned our vision is not just about safe and effective devices, it's high quality, safe and effective devices. And a key aspect to success, and where it starts, is having a culture of quality. And so we have an initiative about promoting a culture of quality and organizational excellence. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a minute. And MDIC is actively involved in our Case for Quality initiative. Let me skip some of the successes from over the past few years, just out of the interest of time. Let me turn to this slide. This gives you the bigger picture of what we're trying to do, what our approach is about. So for starters, you heard Dr. Califf talk about flexible thinking. Well, that's being baked into how we're approaching technology. Flexible regulatory paradigms. The idea of not taking technologies and simply putting them down cookie-cutter pathways, but designing the regulatory pathway around the technology to best meet its needs for evidence generation, innovation cycles, and timely patient access. And you can see a lot of this on display in what we've been doing in digital health technologies. And the overarching framework is one, patient-centered. How we're taking into account the perspectives of patients in a lot of the work that we do. Total product life cycle. Moving away from the artificial constructs of pre-market and post-market. I'm going to show you that in action in a few minutes. And then making explicit and addressing the benefit-risk trade-offs. And we say benefit-risk, not risk-benefit. Benefit-risk, because that's where it starts from. And we're not just talking about the product, the benefit risks of the product. It's the benefit risk trade-offs of the decisions that we make. Those impacts not just on companies, but on society more generally. Their impact on patients. And if you look in the middle of the screen now, here's what we've been doing. So first of all, that benefit risk approach, we've made explicit starting in 2012 with pre-market approval decisions. We've gone on to then tailoring that kind of approach to different kinds of decisions around clinical trials. And now this past year put out policy about how you tailor those considerations around post-market decision-making, like recalls and device shortages and granting variances for PMA. And if you look under evidence generation, you'll see we've got clinical trials and real-world evidence packaged together. Because where we're headed is trying to move away from, we have a traditional clinical trial, we get observational data out of real-world data sources. We need to be thinking about there's clinical data. And how do we assure it's sufficiently relevant and reliable to be able to use it to make regulatory or other decisions? That's the way to think about it. And one of the things we're thinking about doing within the center is taking those various work streams and bringing it together on more of a clinical evidence program rather than simply clinical trials and real-world data as we do today. And if you move down then the chart, as you think about, all right, generating evidence, then the question is, when do I need that evidence? Do I need a pre-market? Can I shift to post-market? And the issue here now is about uncertainty. Every time we make a decision on a device, we always have uncertainty. There's no device we put on the market that we know everything about it. The question is, how much do you accept? Because if you're treating a life-threatening disease and you have no alternative, you will accept more uncertainty than in a common disease. I got lots of options out there, right? So now if you think about it, look at the other side, the science of patient input. Part of what we're doing now is how can we use science to truly understand the uncertainty that patients are willing to accept in different circumstances, and then factor that into our decisions on data shifts and on design of clinical trials. And then also using that science for assessing patient preferences. What are the trade-offs patients are willing to make in benefit and risk? And again, factor that into decision-making, because you always have to put a value on benefits and risk. The question is, whose values do you take into account? FDA reviewers or the people for whom that technology is going to be used on? And then in designing clinical trials, think about, again, how we take patient preferences into their design, and the same in our use of real-world evidence. And that's how all of these link together. NEST becomes now foundational as infrastructure and approach for how we enhance the reliability of data and the infrastructure for getting clinical data. And MDIC has been our biggest partner in all of this work, as you know and as you'll hear more about today. I mentioned some of the challenges with clinical trials. The other issue we deal with is our products on the market, and new safety issues come up, or greater safety issues. We rely on passive surveillance, which means a human being has to identify the problem, make the decision that it's probably associated with this device, and then take the time to report it. And hence, technology can be out there. By the time we identify a problem, we have a lot of notable cases. Many patients have been exposed to it unnecessarily. Who gets harmed? The patient gets harmed. The company gets harmed because consumer confidence is lost. If you can identify it more quickly and address it, you resolve both of those issues. And as we move to the greater focus on real-world data and infrastructure for it, you now can get to data sets and larger data sets in which you don't have the human being looking for the issue. You can use technology. Now, fundamental in this and the challenge we have to address is the following: how we sufficiently reduce the transaction costs for data consistency, quality, and collection into and extraction out of electronic health records. And such that, and this is where we have to go, clinical research is incorporated into clinical practice. Now, in some respects, it happens today. A lot of medical practice has not been established. It is clinical research, but we don't systematically gather data on it. And then if we want to get more data, there's high transaction costs today. So the question is how you reduce that. And if you do, then it's the clinical setting, whether in a healthcare facility or in the home, that comes the place where we gather information routinely that informs us on an evolving basis of a better understanding of a device's benefit-risk profile and its use. The strategy that we've been putting to play, we've been working on since 2011. We put it out in 2012. We called it a National Post-Market Surveillance System back then because that was the operative term. But in reality, this is about evaluation. It's not your grandmother's surveillance, and hence the change in title onto NEST. The system, a little bit different from the drug side. We don't own and operate it. It's of, by, and for the ecosystem. I'll explain in a minute. And again, how we're leveraging real-world data to have that evolving understanding of benefit-risk profile. The value proposition for patients, practitioners, hospitals, payers is about having better information to make the decisions and the kinds of decisions that they make. And for industry, the opportunity for more efficient, more timely, lower-cost data collection to support product approval and clearance, to support payer coverage and reimbursement, which is why CMS has been an active partner in the establishment of NEST, being used to address or in lieu of post-market data requirements, whether that might be for MDRs or post-market studies. And we talked about the opportunities were appropriate for some of these greater pre-market, post-market data shifts. And this is sort of the key aspects of NEST. This is what NEST is about. And this is going to be a mouthful, and I'll unpack it in a minute. But you can see to drive down the time and cost and increase the value and use of real-world data to meet the needs of medical device ecosystem stakeholders through a market-driven, collective buying power approach and using a neural network model. So what does that mean? So today, you want to use a real-world data source. You try to contract with that owner. Here are the challenges. There's lots of transaction costs. They're very high. It costs a lot of money to do, a lot of issues to address. And for the data owner, oftentimes their data is very limited in the questions they can answer. The real value becomes if you can create linkages between different data owners. Now, take an approach that has used in a variety of different circumstances, pulled together interested parties, and have a larger group purchasing power behind it. That's what NEST does, bringing together the stakeholders in the ecosystem for now trying to drive greater standardization in the data sets, core data elements, commonalities in data quality, rules of the road on data privacy, the issues about fees, what you pay for the use of data, and in return for the data owners who wish to participate, a larger marketplace. Because now there are people who want to use that data, it's just not in the right form. And the other thing NEST brings to the table is creating those data use agreements, the linkages between data sets that now increase the power of the data. And in setting this up, we had created a multi-stakeholder planning board that the Duke Margolis Center has been running, and they have just put out their third report yesterday. One of the recommendations they made to establish NEST was to create an independent coordinating center that would drive the activities I was just talking about. And the governance for that structure would be representatives from the key stakeholder groups in the medical device ecosystem: patients, providers, industry, payers, and government. And the stakeholder group, the planning board, was represented by folks from those various communities in the ecosystem. And the real success on NEST is the following. To get it up off the ground, you need public and private funding. We'll talk about that. But to really continue, you have to show the return on investment, which is, it is in the user's interest to go through NEST rather than doing it separately, because you've reduced the transaction costs and you increase the value of the data. By a neural network model, traditionally, if you get clinical data, you do a clinical trial, you have a coordinating center, it's a hub and spoke model, you contract out with various clinical trial sites, very time-consuming, very costly. The idea in the neural network model is establish linkages between different data sources that together can address critical questions. And then the coordinating center is about what linkages you need to activate to answer particular questions. And that's one of the roles that NEST and its coordinating center would serve. Now, CDRH has already been engaged since 2011 in over 50 pilots and projects. Some of them are in real-world practice of what we do. So, for example, we were able to leverage data out of the transcatheter valve therapy registry to support a labeling expansion for transcatheter aortic valve replacements. And instead of conducting a clinical trial, we got the data from the registry. That significantly reduced time and cost. But we've also been leveraging registry data as a control arm in clinical trials. So the sponsors conduct a single-arm study, not a two-arm study. And we've done that with left ventricular assist devices, stent grafts, surgical mesh. We've relied on data and databases rather than conducting a study to demonstrate clinical validity for some tests. And some of the companies now have been nesting their post-market studies in registries, seeing a 40 to 60% cost savings. So we're already doing this in practice, but what we haven't been doing is approaching this in a systematic manner. Very recently, I'm proud to say, delighted to say, we have selected MDIC as the coordinating center for NEST. And the agency is giving MDIC $3 million in fiscal year 2017 to get this up off the ground. And under the agreement in principle in MDUFA 4 that we just reached with industry, the industry would give $6 million a year in user fees to the coordinating center for 5 years, starting in fiscal year 2018. So now we're looking at $33 million over the next 6 years coming over to MDIC for work on NEST. One of the other things we've been doing is we've also already tried to get this going by establishing data use agreements with a variety of registries, and we will make that available to NEST. Let me switch gears very briefly, partner with patients. A few things to note of what we've been doing. I mentioned how the science of understanding patient preferences. We just put out our final policy on how to assess and how we would incorporate patient preferences in our decision-making. So this is now official policy, and we view we're up and running. Also under MDUFA 4, we would get funding to establish a patient engagement program and now have the in-house expertise to provide advice and to make use of that data. Also, we are now putting out in our summaries, PMAs, de novos, HDEs, if there was relevant patient preference information we're using in our decision-making. And finally, we think it's critical that everyone in the center is engaging with patients. So we have made a public commitment that by the end of next year, at least 90% of CDRH staff will have engaged with patients, and we will make this an ongoing activity and expectation for our staff. You can't just read about it in the papers. You have to engage with people, and that's not just my reviewers, that's got to be our secretaries. So they understand that when they answer the phone or they return an email. Quality. So on the industry side, we've been trying to establish a marketplace around quality. You buy a car, you can get data and ratings on the safety and quality of your car. I do that all the time when I go shopping. But you can't do that on medical devices. And yet in our talk with users and purchasers, this would be of high value. So we have been working through MDIC and on other venues about setting up that kind of marketplace. What are the right metrics for assessing quality? How do we think about a company growing along the quality scale to sort of a top performer? What does that maturity model look like? And then trying to establish a voluntary certification program around it, make transparent so companies who want to compete around quality, they can do that. But we also believe that applies to the FDA. So we need, and we do have a culture of quality, but we can do a lot better. So in 2013, we put out a framework for quality management. We set up a quality management program. We have an associate director who reports directly to me, and she has a team of people. And we have now been putting in place a more robust quality management system that includes a CAPA, non-CAPA system. Our surveys we conduct on customer satisfaction, all that data gets folded into that system. We're just launching our document control system. And we're training our staff on quality management. In fact, by the end of this year, all of our senior leadership will have gone through training. And we will also be seeing funding in MDUFA 4 for enhancing those activities. I do want to quickly mention precision medicine to follow on what Dr. Califf said. Some of the things we're doing here are radically different from our traditional approach, and it dovetails nicely with some of the work MDIC is doing on IVDs. So traditionally, you'd have a test developer, they'd get their data, they send it over to the FDA. Dr. Califf talked about the challenges now when we deal with in the next generation sequencing space and how we kind of get people to share the data. But there's another aspect on it. Not just getting the clinical community to crowdsource data, which we'd like to see beyond simply next generation sequencing tests, but more generally in diagnostics. But then how, if we can have confidence in a database, what are the standards you need to have confidence? We put out draft policy for that. And then can we get to accord on a standard for interpretation of the data? So the clinical community not just is crowdsourcing data, we have a common approach to interpretation such that the FDA may be able to rely on it, and in some cases maybe in lieu of a formal FDA review. In that respect, working with the clinical community, we see the science and the regulatory side in lockstep and are able to make decisions at a point when the science is ripe for particular claims. So let me end with the following. This was the world of just a few years ago, very classic pre-market, post-market, sort of a fine line for when you get to the marketplace. With our pathway on breakthrough devices and all the various policies on benefit risk and their implementation, you can see this line is starting to become much more flexible in technologies coming to market. Where we're headed, whoops, I went the wrong way, there we go. As we put NEST into place and better leveraging real-world evidence, the opportunity for changing that calculus and having far greater pre-market, post-market data shifts where appropriate and where it's worth accepting more uncertainty. That's the flexible sort of trade-offs in benefit and risk, and particularly when we have confidence in getting data we otherwise would not see and a safety net in this country we have not had before. But here's where we're headed. To move away from pre-market and post-market, instead think about patient access. That as our understanding of the benefit risk profile grows, patient access expands. Now we do that today. If you're conducting clinical studies and you do a first-in-human study, you test 5 patients, 10 patients, because I don't know a lot about that device. I learn from that. I go on to a late feasibility study. Maybe I'm assessing 30 patients. I learn from that. Now I go to a pivotal clinical trial, 100 patients, few hundred patients. Learn from that, product comes on the market, greater expansion. We need to operationalize that as our way of thinking. And if we have the infrastructure in place on data collection, we can make that happen. And we think with some changes in the law on progressive approval and being able to use safety and performance standards for some of our moderate risk devices, this is the world we move to when we think about technology coming to market and the opportunity to even harmonize internationally. What that means, we start thinking about data generation, evidence generation, not just here in the US, we think about it on an international level and how we access and leverage data internationally for product coming to market across the globe. Thank you.